The hospital corridor stretched endlessly, its walls stained with the ghostly residue of time. Flickering fluorescent lights buzzed, casting uneven shadows that seemed alive. It was 1973, and deep within the confines of St. Harlan's, an experiment was unfolding, one destined to be erased from history. Dr. Calloway, a gaunt man with hollow eyes and trembling hands, leaned over his journal, scribbling feverishly. The room was suffused with an unnatural tension, the air thick and suffocating. A patient lay strapped to the operating table, their pale skin slick with sweat, their eyes darting wildly. "Administer the serum," Calloway commanded. His voice cracked with urgency. The assistant hesitated, glancing nervously at the syringe filled with a luminescent green fluid. "Dr. Calloway, what if this—" "Do it," Calloway barked, his tone sharp enough to slice through the assistant's reluctance. The needle pierced the patient's arm, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the body convulsed violently, the restraints creaking under the strain. The heart monitor flatlined with a shrill beep. "Doctor," the assistant whispered, backing away as the lights above them flickered in chaotic bursts. A low, resonant hum began to fill the room. The patient's chest heaved unnaturally, then stilled. Slowly, their head twisted to face Calloway, eyes now voids of blackness. Inside those voids, pinpricks of light swirled like distant galaxies. "What have you done?" The patient's voice emerged, a grotesque amalgam of tones, human and inhuman alike. Calloway stumbled back, his journal falling to the floor. The patient's restraints snapped as if cut by invisible hands, and the last thing seen was Calloway's face, frozen in a mask of pure terror as the screen faded to black. The modern world came into focus as a car rumbled down an empty, fog-drenched road. Inside, Emily sat in the back seat, her phone glowing faintly in her hands. Her thumb hovered over an article titled, "The Experiments of St. Harlan's. Fact or Folklore?" The headline was accompanied by a grainy black and white photo of the hospital's crumbling facade. The car hit a bump, jolting her back to the present. She glanced up to see the hospital looming in the distance. Its silhouette cut sharply against the overcast sky, vines snaking up its walls as if the earth itself was trying to reclaim it. Ryan drove, his fingers drumming rhythmically on the steering wheel. "This is going to be epic," he said, his voice filled with a nervous energy. Jason, seated in the passenger seat, grunted. "Epic or stupid?" "Probably stupid." From the back, Sophie clutched her knees to her chest, her gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "Do we really have to go in?" she murmured, barely audible. "Yes," Emily said firmly, her eyes narrowing at the sight of the hospital. She hadn't come all this way for doubts. Her grandmother's ghost, both literal and metaphorical, haunted her every step. As they approached the gates, Emily's phone buzzed. A new message lit up the screen. "Don't go there." Her stomach tightened. She glanced at the others, but none of them seemed to notice. The car slowed to a stop, the group staring silently at the words painted across the hospital's rotting facade. What was forgotten should have stayed buried. The silence was broken by a mechanical creak as the hospital gates swung open on their own. They exchanged uneasy glances, the sound of rusted metal lingering in the still air. "This is it," Ryan said, forcing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Together, they stepped out of the car, their footsteps swallowed by the fog as they moved toward the entrance. Behind them, the gates groaned shut, sealing the night's fate. The four of them stood before the entrance of St. Harlan's Hospital, its massive wooden doors scarred with age and neglect. The air around them felt heavy, thick with a humidity that made it hard to breathe. The faint scent of mildew mixed with something more unsettling, something metallic and sharp. Ryan was the first to move, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the growing darkness. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, masking his apprehension with bravado. Jason gave him a sidelong glance. "Great idea. Let's charge into the creepy death trap. Nothing could possibly go wrong." Sophie lingered at the back, her gaze darting between the imposing building and the long road that had brought them here. She gripped Emily's arm. "Are we sure about this?" We could just leave. Emily's jaw tightened as she pulled her arm free. No one's leaving. Not until I find out what happened here. Her grandmother's name whispered in her mind like a prayer, the unanswered questions fueling her resolve. Ryan pushed the doors open with a loud creak. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the hospital itself were hollow yet alive. The first thing they noticed was the cold. It wasn't the natural chill of an abandoned building. It felt deliberate, the kind of cold that seeped into the bones and gnawed at them. Their flashlights illuminated cracked tile floors, peeling wallpaper, and a reception desk that seemed frozen in time. Faded patient charts and a rusted bell sat atop the counter, untouched by years of decay. Jason swept his beam across the room. Looks like every horror movie ever made. What's next? Blood dripping from the ceiling? Emily ignored him, moving toward the reception desk. A single chair sat behind it, the upholstery torn and stained. A faint metallic hum buzzed in her ears, growing louder as she approached. On the desk was a dusty, faded nameplate. Drive E. Calloway, Chief Researcher. She frowned, her fingers hovering over the nameplate. Suddenly, her phone buzzed violently in her pocket. She jumped, nearly knocking the plate to the floor. Pulling out her phone, she saw another message. The same number as before. The text was simple: "Leave now." "Who keeps texting me?" she muttered. "What's wrong?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Emily hesitated. "Nothing. Just my phone glitching." She slid it back into her pocket, unwilling to show her uncertainty. Ryan had wandered into the center of the room, his flashlight illuminating a set of symbols carved into the floor. They looked ancient, intricate, and wrong. "Hey, check this out." Jason joined him, peering at the strange markings. "What the hell is that? Some kind of cult crap?" Before Ryan could respond, their flashlights flickered in unison. The light dimmed, then blinked out entirely, plunging them in a suffocating darkness. "What the?" Jason smacked the side of his flashlight, but it refused to cooperate. The others fumbled with their lights, but none would turn back on. The hum Emily had heard earlier grew louder, vibrating through the air like a distant scream. "Guys," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something's moving." They froze, straining to hear over the growing hum. Footsteps, soft, deliberate, and far too close. Ryan cursed under his breath. "Hello? Who's there?" The only response was a raspy exhale, as if the hospital itself were breathing. Emily turned toward the entrance, but the doors were no longer visible. The beam of her flashlight suddenly flickered back to life, casting weak light onto the floor. The symbols Ryan had found now glowed faintly, pulsing with a dull red hue. The others' flashlights sputtered back on as well, their beams shakier than before. The faint rasping sound returned, circling them like a predator. Jason stepped toward the entrance. "I don't like this. Let's get the hell out of here." Before anyone could agree, the door to the left of the reception desk creaked open on its own. It revealed a dimly lit hallway, impossibly long, its walls lined with old medical equipment. The air that drifted out was colder still, carrying the faintest scent of rot. "Yeah, no," Jason said, stepping back. "We're not going in there." Emily took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I am." She turned to the others, her flashlight trembling in her grip. "You can stay here if you want, but I'm finding out what happened in this place." Ryan hesitated for a moment, then followed her. "We stick together. That's the rule, right?" Sophie looked at Jason, her eyes pleading. He sighed. "Fine, but the second something tries to kill us, we're out of here." Together, they stepped into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash. None of them noticed the shadows crawling along the walls, silently following. The slam of the door reverberated through the corridor, and the four of them froze. Sophie clutched Ryan's arm, her breathing shallow. "That's it. We're trapped," Jason muttered, his flashlight beam darting between the peeling walls. Emily, undeterred, pressed forward. The hallway stretched impossibly far, with doors lining each side. Some were ajar, revealing glimpses of decayed hospital rooms, while others were sealed shut with rusted chains. What kind of hospital was this? Ryan asked, his voice low. Emily's gaze settled on an old gurney, its wheels locked in place under a flickering overhead light. An experiment in desperation, she replied. As they moved, their footsteps echoed unnaturally, as if the walls themselves were amplifying every sound. Sophie tugged at Ryan's sleeve. Did you hear that? Hear what? Footsteps. But not ours. They stopped. The air thickened around them, heavy with an oppressive stillness. From somewhere behind, the sound of faint, uneven steps echoed. A shuffle, then a scrape, drawing closer. Jason spun around, his flashlight aimed down the darkened hallway. Who's there? Silence. Then, faintly, a voice. Help me. The voice was brittle and hoarse, as though the speaker's throat were lined with dust. It came from one of the chained doors to their left. Sophie whimpered and backed away, clutching her flashlight tightly. We should leave, she whispered. Ryan hesitated, staring at the door. We can't just ignore it. Watch me, Jason snapped. But Emily was already moving toward the sound. The chains looked old, rusted nearly to the point of breaking. With trembling hands, she reached out and brushed the padlock. It fell away as though it had never been secured. What are you doing? Jason hissed. Emily didn't answer. She pushed the door open, her flashlight revealing a small room. Inside was an ancient hospital bed with a thin, skeletal figure lying motionless beneath stained sheets. The stench of decay hit them like a wave, and Sophie gagged. The figure's head tilted slightly toward Emily. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Help me. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Who are you? The figure's jaw moved with agonizing slowness. You shouldn't be here. Emily stepped closer despite herself, her flashlight trembling. The figure's bony hand reached out, impossibly long fingers curling toward her. He sees you, it croaked. Who sees us? Emily asked, but the figure's body suddenly convulsed. A sharp, wet sound filled the room as it twisted unnaturally, its mouth stretching wide in a silent scream. Emily, get back! Jason shouted, grabbing her arm and yanking her away. The figure collapsed, dissolving into a fine gray ash that scattered across the bed. As the last particles faded, a loud crash came from the hallway. Ryan leaned into the corridor, his flashlight catching the sight of another door slamming shut further down. This place is messing with us, he muttered. Messing with us? It's trying to kill us. Jason snapped. Emily's face was pale, but her voice was steady. We're not turning back. There's something here, something connected to my grandmother. I know it. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Sophie screamed, pointing at the walls. Shadows writhed across the peeling paint, moving like smoke. They shifted and merged, forming shapes that were vaguely human before dispersing again. Stay together, Emily ordered, her voice firmer now. They pressed onward, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, looping back on itself in impossible ways. Every so often, their flashlights would catch glimpses of movement, shadows slithering just out of sight, always watching. Jason stopped abruptly. Didn't we pass that gurney already? He pointed to a rusted gurney half buried in the wall, its frame twisted unnaturally. Sophie clutched her head, her voice shaking. We're walking in circles. It's keeping us here. Emily crouched near the gurney, noticing something scratched into the floor beneath it. The symbols were similar to the ones in the reception area, but arranged differently, like a code. What is this? She murmured. Ryan crouched beside her, studying the markings. Looks like Latin, maybe? Or some kind of runes. Can you read it? Emily asked. Ryan shook his head. No, but I've seen these before. In my grandfather's notes. Jason stepped back, his face darkening. What are you talking about? Ryan hesitated, then sighed. My grandfather was one of the doctors here. He was involved in the experiments. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. You knew about this? Emily asked, her voice rising. Not everything. Ryan snapped. I just wanted to see if the stories were true. That's all. Before they could say more, the ground beneath them rumbled. The walls groaned as the hallway seemed to shift, doors appearing and disappearing in the blink of an eye. From somewhere ahead came a deep, resonant growl. A voice echoed through the corridor, low and menacing. "Welcome home." The hospital was alive, and it was just getting started. The growling voice reverberated through the hallway, its tone heavy with malice. The group huddled together instinctively, flashlights shaking in their hands. Emily swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the twisting shadows that writhed across the walls like living things. What was that?" Sophie stammered, clutching Jason's arm. Jason didn't answer. He was too busy scanning the corridor, his jaw set tight. "We need to move. Standing here makes us sitting ducks." "But move where?" Ryan asked, his voice rising with tension. "This place keeps changing. We're gonna get lost." Emily straightened, her flashlight steady now. "Then we stick to the symbols," she said, pointing at the floor. "If they mean something to this place, maybe they'll lead us somewhere." Ryan nodded reluctantly, his earlier bravado replaced by unease. "Fine, but let's move fast. I don't want to find out what made that sound." As they pressed forward, the air grew colder, their breath forming white clouds. The walls on either side began to narrow, the peeling paint giving way to slick, dark surfaces that pulsed faintly, as though alive. This isn't normal," Sophie whispered, her voice quivering. "Walls aren't supposed to do that." Emily stopped suddenly, her flashlight catching a glint of something metallic embedded in the wall ahead. She stepped closer, squinting. "It's a door handle." The others joined her, staring at the featureless metal door that had appeared in the wall. There was no frame or hinges, just the handle protruding from the smooth surface. "Should we open it?" Ryan asked, though his tone suggested he didn't want an answer. Jason scoffed. "Sure, why not? Let's see what other nightmares this place has for us." Ignoring him, Emily reached for the handle. The metal was cold against her skin, sending a shiver up her arm. With a deep breath, she turned it and pushed. The door opened with a sound like tearing fabric. Beyond it was a large, circular room, the walls lined with tall shelves stacked haphazardly with medical files, broken equipment, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room stood a single operating table, its surface stained with something dark and sticky. "This isn't right," Ryan murmured, stepping inside reluctantly. "It looks like someone left in a hurry." Emily approached the table, her flashlight sweeping over the objects around it. There were rusted surgical tools, faded Polaroids pinned to a corkboard, and a thick journal with a cracked leather cover. She grabbed the journal and flipped it open, skimming the brittle pages. The handwriting was frantic, erratic, and scrawled in places over diagrams of human anatomy. One word caught her eye, repeated several times across the pages: transference. "What's it say?" Jason asked, peering over her shoulder. Emily traced the word with her finger. "It's about experiments. Something to do with souls, transferring them into other bodies." Sophie gasped. They were experimenting on people's souls? Ryan's face darkened. "That's what my grandfather was working on. He believed that if you could remove someone's soul, you could isolate diseases, cure anything." He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the table. Emily's fingers brushed over a drawing in the journal, a crude sketch of a human figure with black voids where the eyes should be. Beneath it were the words, "Host compatibility unstable. Risk of dimensional fracture high." A low groan echoed through the room, followed by a sharp cracking sound. The group looked up as a jagged fissure split the air in the far corner, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The sound was like bones snapping and glass shattering all at once. "What the hell is that?" Jason demanded, backing away. "It's a rift," Ryan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather wrote about these. If the experiments went wrong, they could..." A shadowy form began to emerge from the fissure, its edges shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a strong wind. The shape was vaguely humanoid, but its limbs were too long, its head tilting at unnatural angles as it moved. "Run!" Emily shouted, pulling Sophie toward the door. The shadow gave a guttural growl, its hollow eyes locking onto the group. As they fled into the hallway, it followed, its movements jerky but impossibly fast. The walls began to twist and warp around them, the corridor narrowing one moment and expanding the next. The flickering lights overhead cast elongated shadows that danced wildly, almost taunting them. "This way," Emily called, leading them down a side passage. They burst into another room, slamming the door behind them. Jason jammed a broken chair under the handle to block it. The shadow pounded against the door, the sound vibrating through the walls. "Is it going to hold?" Sophie asked, her voice breaking. Jason shook his head, breathing hard. "Not for long." Emily clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. The rift, the shadow, the experiments. They were all connected. But how? Before she could say anything, the pounding stopped. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. Ryan approached the door cautiously, his ear pressed against it. "I think it's gone," he whispered. But as the others began to relax, Emily noticed something. On the floor, beneath the dim light of her flashlight, another set of symbols was etched into the tile. They glowed faintly, pulsing in sync with her own heartbeat. "We didn't escape it," she said, her voice trembling. "It's still here, and it's waiting for us." The glow of the symbols beneath Emily's feet pulsed like a heartbeat, steady but foreboding. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared, the light casting eerie shadows on the cracked walls of the room. "Emily," Jason said cautiously, his eyes darting to the glowing floor. "What do you mean? It's still here. The shadow thing is gone, right?" Emily shook her head, clutching the journal tighter. "It's not gone. These symbols, they're tied to it somehow. They're like a signal, and we're standing right in the middle of it." Ryan stepped back, his flashlight flickering. "What's that supposed to mean? Are we bait?" "No," Emily said, her voice tightening. "We're part of its game." From the hallway came a faint creak, like the slow opening of a heavy door. All four of them froze. The oppressive silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. "What's it waiting for?" Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible. The light in the room dimmed suddenly, and a sound like soft, shuffling footsteps began to grow louder. Emily's flashlight sputtered, and her hands tightened around it. "It's testing us," she said, her mind racing. "This isn't just random chaos. It's leading us somewhere." Jason let out a bitter laugh. "Leading us? Great. Straight to our graves." Ryan ignored him, his focus narrowing on the journal in Emily's hands. "There has to be something in there, some clue about what we're dealing with." Emily opened the journal again, flipping through its fragile pages with trembling hands. Words and diagrams blurred as her eyes scanned the chaotic scrawl. One entry stood out, hastily written and underlined. "The host sees all. Do not engage. Trust no reflection." "Trust no reflection?" Sophie asked, peering over Emily's shoulder. "What does that mean?" Before Emily could answer, the old mirror on the far wall flickered to life. Its surface rippled like water, distorting their reflections into grotesque parodies of themselves. Sophie gasped and turned away, but Jason stared transfixed. "Jason, don't look at it," Emily warned. Too late. Jason's reflection smirked, even though his face remained neutral. It raised a hand slowly, then pressed it against the glass. A low hum filled the room as the reflection smirk twisted into something impossibly wide, its teeth jagged and unnatural. "Jason, move!" Ryan shouted, grabbing his arm. Jason snapped out of his daze, just as a long, skeletal arm reached out from the mirror, its clawed fingers aimed straight for him. He stumbled back, and the glass surface returned to normal with a shuddering crack. "What the hell was that?" Jason shouted, his chest heaving. "The host," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "It's the thing controlling this place. It sees everything we do, and it's using the hospital to get inside our heads." The symbols on the floor flared brighter, and the door creaked open on its own. Beyond it, the hallway had transformed. The walls were now lined with broken, dusty mirrors, each one reflecting distorted versions of the group. "This feels like a trap," Ryan muttered, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. "It is," Emily said, her jaw tightening. "But staying here isn't an option." They stepped cautiously into the hallway, the mirrors on either side warping and shifting as they moved. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. Sophie whimpered. "It's watching us, isn't it? Through the mirrors." "Probably," Jason muttered. "Let's just keep moving." As they passed each mirror, the reflections grew more disturbing. Ryan's image had black voids where his eyes should be. Sophie's face was stretched unnaturally long, her mouth open in a silent scream. Jason's reflection showed him standing alone, blood dripping from his hands. Emily's reflection froze her in place. It was her, but aged, her skin gray and lifeless, her eyes sunken and hollow. The reflection smiled faintly, mouthing words she couldn't hear. "Emily, come on," Ryan called, snapping her out of her trance. She tore her eyes away and hurried after them, her heart pounding. Ahead, the hallway ended abruptly at a door covered in chains. Latin phrases were etched into the metal, glowing faintly. "Let me guess," Jason said. "That's where it wants us to go." Emily nodded, stepping forward. She reached for the chains, but a sudden voice whispered from the mirrors behind them. "Leave it closed," it hissed. The group spun around, their flashlights darting wildly across the warped reflections. All of the mirrored versions of themselves had turned to face the door, their faces eerily calm. "What do we do?" Sophie whispered, trembling. Emily looked at the journal in her hand, then at the door. "We go through." "That's insane," Jason protested. "What if this is exactly what it wants?" Emily's eyes burned with determination. "It's the only way to find answers. If we keep running, we'll never escape." Before anyone could argue further, she grabbed the chains. They fell away with a metallic clang, and the door creaked open. Beyond it was darkness, deep and impenetrable. A faint sound echoed from within, soft whispers, overlapping and growing louder. "Stay close," Emily said, stepping inside. As they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging them into total blackness. The whispers rose to a deafening cacophony, and the last thing they saw was the glow of the symbols burning on the floor. The host was waiting, and they were walking straight into its domain. The darkness was suffocating, pressing against them like a living thing. The whispers that filled the air were layered and overlapping, words impossible to discern, yet deeply unsettling. Emily's flashlight flickered, barely piercing the void. Where are we?" Sophie's voice was trembling, her hand gripping Ryan's sleeve so tightly it was cutting off circulation. Ryan shone his light ahead, its weak beam swallowed by the oppressive black. "I don't think we're in the hospital anymore." Jason ran his hand along the wall beside him, expecting cold plaster or cracked tile. Instead, his fingers met something soft and warm, like flesh. He recoiled with a shudder. "What the hell is this place?" Emily focused on the journal, flipping to a page where a crude map of the hospital had been drawn. But now, the lines bled and shifted before her eyes, making it unreadable. "This isn't just a place," Emily said, her voice low. "We're inside the host domain." The whispers suddenly stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that made the group hold their breath. Then, from the darkness, a deep, resonant voice emerged, vibrating through the air like a low hum. "You entered where you do not belong," it said. The voice was neither male nor female, but something other, something ancient. "You have seen what should remain unseen." Emily stepped forward, trying to steady her voice. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" The voice chuckled, a hollow, bone-chilling sound. "I'm the gatekeeper and the gate, the healer and the curse. You sought truth, and now you stand in its shadow." "What truth?" Ryan asked, his voice defiant despite the tremor in it. The voice didn't answer directly. Instead, the darkness seemed to shift and ripple around them, and faint shapes began to take form. The group's flashlights flickered as they revealed figures in old hospital uniforms, doctors and nurses frozen mid-motion, their faces contorted in anguish. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, watching. Emily's stomach twisted. The experiments, they're still here. Jason stepped back, shaking his head. "This isn't real. This can't be real. It's as real as the pain they endured," the voice said, growing louder. "They linger, trapped between worlds, remnants of the sins committed here. One of the ghostly figures turned its head toward them, its mouth opening unnaturally wide. A distorted scream ripped through the air, and the group staggered back, clutching their ears. "Enough!" Emily shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. "If you want something from us, just say it. Why are we here?" The voice fell silent for a moment. Then, with a chilling calmness, it replied, "You are here because you chose to be. Each of you carries a thread tied to this place, a thread that cannot be severed without sacrifice." "What does that mean?" Sophie asked, tears streaming down her face. The room began to brighten faintly, revealing more of the grotesque surroundings. The walls were pulsating like a giant organ, veins running through them, and the floor was slick with a dark, viscous liquid. In the center of the room stood a figure shrouded in shadow, its outline constantly shifting, as if it couldn't hold a single form. Emily took a cautious step forward. "What do you mean, Tide? What do you want us to do?" The shadowy figure stretched an impossibly long arm toward her, and she flinched. In its hand, something glowed faintly, a shard of broken glass. "Face the truth," the voice said. "Only one will leave. Choose." Sophie gasped. "What?" Ryan's voice rose in panic. "Choose what? What are you talking about?" The whispers returned, growing louder and more insistent. The glowing shard in the figure's hand pulsed in time with the beating of the walls. Emily's mind raced as she gripped the journal tighter. "Don't listen to it," Jason shouted. "It's just trying to mess with us. We don't have to do anything." But the figure stepped closer, the shard in its hand illuminating its face, or lack thereof. It was a void, an emptiness that drew their eyes and made their stomachs churn. "You must choose," the voice repeated. Emily's breath hitched as she realized the shard wasn't just glowing, it was showing something. Reflected in its fractured surface were their faces, but not as they were. The images flickered between versions of themselves, age decayed, or filled with fear and rage. The voice grew louder, echoing all around them. "Choose who carries the burden. Choose who remains." Sophie collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "I don't understand. Please, just let us go." Emily's grip on the journal tightened as she stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the shard. She had come for answers, but the price was higher than she ever imagined. "Wait," Ryan said, grabbing her arm. His voice was unsteady. What if it's lying? What if this is just another trick?" Emily met his gaze, her heart pounding. "And what if it's not? What if we're already too far in?" The shard's light grew blinding, and the shadows around them began to close in. The whispers turned into a roar, a chaotic cacophony that drowned out everything else. The host's voice cut through the noise, its tone final. "Choose." The room fell silent as the group looked at one another, each of them knowing the weight of the decision they faced. The oppressive silence stretched, suffocating them as the glowing shard hovered between the group and the host's shifting form. The whispers had faded into a dull hum that vibrated in their bones, reminding them with every pulse that time was slipping away. Emily's knuckles turned white around the journal she clutched to her chest. She scanned the others, the weight of the decision pressing down like a vice. Sophie's tear-streaked face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Jason looked ready to fight, his fists clenched, though his darting eyes betrayed his fear. Ryan stood frozen, his gaze fixed on the shard as though it might swallow him whole. "What happens if we don't choose?" Jason asked, his voice tight. The host's hollow figure shifted, the shadows around it deepening. "The burden remains. You all stay." Sophie let out a soft whimper, her trembling hands clutching her chest. We can't do this. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Emily said firmly, though her stomach churned. "If we don't make a choice, this thing will keep us here forever. It's part of the experiment, part of the way this place works." "How do you know that?" Ryan snapped, his voice cracking. "What if it's just another trick? What if we choose and we all still die?" Emily hesitated. She didn't have an answer, but the journal in her hands felt like an anchor. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we can't just stand here. We have to do something." Jason stepped forward, his jaw set. Then I say we fight it. If it wants a sacrifice, it can take me over my dead body. It might take you literally on that, Ryan muttered. Enough! Emily's voice cut through the rising tension. This isn't about fighting or running. It's about ending this. If one of us doesn't take the burden, we'll never leave. And this thing, it'll make us choose eventually. One way or another. The shard pulsed again, and the host tilted its head, its featureless face turning toward Emily. Your time is running thin, it said. Sophie sobbed harder, collapsing to the floor. I can't do it. Don't make me do this. Please don't. Emily knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Sophie, she said gently, though her voice trembled. No one's making you do anything, but we have to decide, together. Jason's eyes darted between them and the host. And what happens to the one who takes it, huh? What does the burden even mean? The host's voice filled the room, resonating like a bell. The burden is the tether. To carry it is to bind your soul to this place, to become part of its foundation. You will remain so others may leave. Great, Jason muttered. So one of us becomes the next creepy shadow thing, while everyone else gets a free pass. Emily stood, her gaze steady. It's not about a free pass. It's about breaking the cycle. Someone has to stop this from happening again. Ryan's face twisted with frustration. How do you know we're breaking anything? What if we're just feeding it? What if this is exactly what it wants? Emily stepped closer to him, her voice low but firm. Do you have a better idea? The room fell silent again. The shard pulsed brighter, and the walls around them began to close in, shrinking the space as the host loomed larger. The choice is upon you, it said. Jason looked at Sophie, then at Emily and Ryan. His shoulders slumped as his defiance drained away. We can't keep stalling. Someone has to. I'll do it. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. All eyes turned to Ryan, who had stepped forward, his expression grim but resolute. Ryan, no, Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. He shook his head. This started with my family. My grandfather helped create this nightmare. If anyone deserves to pay for it, it's me. Emily's throat tightened, but she forced herself to speak. Ryan, you don't have to. Yes, I do, he interrupted, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. You said it yourself, Emily. We're tied to this place. And if I'm the one who takes the burden, maybe it'll end. Maybe it'll stop for good. He stepped toward the shard, his hand trembling as he reached for it. The host loomed closer, its shadow stretching to encompass him. Ryan, wait, Sophie cried, but he didn't stop. As his fingers closed around the shard, the glow intensified, filling the room with blinding light. Ryan gasped, his body stiffening as the light seemed to seep into his skin. The host's voice boomed, triumphant. The burden is accepted. Ryan turned to the group, his face pale but calm. Go, he said, his voice soft but firm. Get out of here. Don't look back. The walls began to dissolve into darkness, the shadows peeling away to reveal a faint light in the distance. The hospital was letting them go. Ryan, no. Sophie tried to run to him, but Jason held her back, his face grim. Emily locked eyes with Ryan one last time, her heart breaking. Thank you, she whispered, before turning and pulling Sophie toward the light. As the three of them ran, the whispers faded, and the oppressive weight lifted. They didn't stop until they were outside, the cold night air hitting them like a slap. Behind them, the hospital stood silent and still. The doors were shut, the windows dark. Ryan was gone, and somewhere inside, the host had a new tether. The three of them stood outside the hospital, panting, the chill of the night air doing little to calm their frayed nerves. Behind them, St. Harlan's loomed in eerie silence, its windows like empty eyes staring back. Sophie collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. We left him in there. Jason dropped to sit on the cracked pavement, his face pale and drawn. He made his choice, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. We didn't have a choice. Emily stood apart from them, her gaze locked on the hospital. Her hands were still clutching the journal, its leather covered damp with sweat. A wave of nausea rolled over her as she replayed the scene in her mind. Ryan stepping forward, his resolve unshaken, even as he sealed his fate. "What happens now?" Sophie whimpered, looking up at Emily with tear-streaked eyes. Emily didn't answer immediately. The journal in her hands felt heavier than before, as though it carried the weight of all the lives touched by the horrors within the hospital's walls. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice hollow. Jason let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. "You don't know? After everything we just went through? After Ryan? After what he did?" He gestured toward the hospital. "You've been acting like you had all the answers this whole time." Emily turned to face him, her eyes dark and tired. "I never said I had all the answers, Jason. I was just trying to survive. Same as you." "Some survival," he snapped. "One of us is gone, and we're standing here like sitting ducks. What if that thing decides it's not done with us?" The words hung heavy in the air. Jason wasn't wrong. The hospital, though quiet now, felt far from dormant. "We can't stay here," Emily said, her tone firm. "Whatever Ryan did, it gave us a chance. We need to take it and leave." Sophie sniffled, wiping her face. "But where do we go? How do we even explain this?" Jason stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "We don't explain it. We never talk about this again." "That's not an option," Emily said sharply. She held up the journal. "This place might have let us go, but it's not over. Not really. We can't just pretend this didn't happen." Jason stepped closer, his voice low and angry. "And what do you plan to do, Emily? March into town and tell everyone about a haunted hospital and a shadow monster? You think they'll believe you?" "I don't care if they believe me," she shot back. "I'm not going to let Ryan's sacrifice mean nothing. People need to know what happened here. Maybe someone can stop it for good." Sophie stood shakily, her voice soft. "But what if it can't be stopped? What if it's just always there?" Emily hesitated, looking at the hospital again. "Then at least we tried." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken fears. Finally, Jason sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You do what you want, Emily. But I'm done. I just want to go home and forget this ever happened." He turned and started walking toward the car, his steps slow and heavy. Sophie lingered, glancing between Emily and Jason. "Emily, I'm scared. What if it follows us?" "It won't," Emily said, though she wasn't entirely sure. Ryan made sure of that. Sophie nodded reluctantly, then hurried to catch up with Jason. Emily stayed behind for a moment, her gaze fixed on the hospital. The air felt different now, lighter, almost, but the weight of the night's events pressed down on her chest. "Ryan," she whispered, "I'll make sure it wasn't for nothing." Clutching the journal tightly, she turned and followed the others. As they drove away, the hospital grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it vanished entirely. Sophie sat in the back seat, staring at her hands, while Jason drove in tense silence. Emily held the journal in her lap, flipping through its pages. The words and diagrams felt darker now, more sinister. One entry caught her eye, scrawled in shaky handwriting near the back. "The burden must be carried, but it is never destroyed. Beware its whispers." Her heart sank. She closed the journal, her mind racing. Ryan had taken the burden, but the words suggested it wasn't a permanent solution. "Are you okay?" Sophie's voice was soft, breaking the silence. Emily forced a nod. "Yeah, just tired." Jason gripped the wheel tighter. "We're all tired." The miles stretched on, the weight of the hospital fading into the distance. But in Emily's mind, the shadows lingered. And somewhere far behind them, in the heart of St. Harlan's, the host waited. Its domain was quiet now, but the faint glow of the rift shimmered in the darkness, a reminder that some doors are never truly closed. The drive away from the hospital was long and silent, punctuated only by the sound of tires on the uneven road. The weight of Ryan's sacrifice hung heavily over the three survivors, each of them lost in their thoughts. Jason's grip on the steering wheel tightened with every mile, his knuckles white against the worn leather. His jaw was clenched, his gaze fixed straight ahead, as though looking anywhere else would drag him back to the nightmare they'd barely escaped. In the back seat, Sophie stared blankly out the window, her knees drawn to her chest. Her face was pale, and her hands trembled as she clutched the necklace she always wore. a gift from her grandmother. Emily sat in the passenger seat, the journal in her lap. She'd stopped flipping through its pages, but the words and images burned in her mind. The burden must be carried. Beware its whispers. Finally, Jason broke the silence, his voice tight with frustration. So, what now? What's your big plan, Emily? You gonna take that journal to the cops? A newspaper? Good luck getting anyone to believe you. Emily turned to him, her eyes hard. I don't care if they believe me. This isn't about convincing anyone. It's about stopping this from happening again. Jason scoffed. And how do you plan to do that? Go back in? Start your own experiments? Emily glared at him. I'll find another way. There has to be something in this journal. Some clue we missed. Missed? We didn't miss anything, Emily. We survived. That's it. And if you're smart, you'll let it go. Sophie spoke softly from the back seat, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan didn't let it go. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Jason sighed heavily. Yeah, well, Ryan made his choice. He played the hero, and now he's gone. We're still here. We don't owe that place anything. Emily's grip on the journal tightened. You're wrong. We owe him everything. Jason slammed his hand against the wheel, the car swerving slightly. You want to go on some crusade, fine, but leave me out of it. I've had enough of this horror show. Sophie flinched, her voice trembling. Please stop. Just stop. The tension in the car was unbearable, but they fell silent again, each retreating into their thoughts. When they finally reached the edge of town, Jason pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its cheerful glow a sharp contrast to the grim expressions of the group. I need coffee, Jason muttered, cutting the engine. He stepped out of the car without waiting for a response, the door slamming behind him. Sophie hesitated, glancing at Emily. Are we going to be okay? Emily forced a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. Sophie nodded, but the fear in her eyes remained. As Emily stepped out of the car, she felt a strange sensation, a faint prickling at the back of her neck. She turned, her gaze sweeping over the empty parking lot and the quiet street beyond. Nothing, but it didn't feel like nothing. She shook it off and followed Jason into the diner, the journal clutched tightly under her arm. The diner was almost empty, save for a bored waitress leaning against the counter and a lone man sipping coffee in the corner booth. Jason ordered a coffee and sat down heavily in a booth near the window. Sophie slid in next to him, her movements slow and exhausted. Emily sat across from them, placing the journal on the table. She opened it again, flipping through the pages with a determined expression. Jason groaned. Can you put that thing away for 5 minutes? I told you I'm not letting this go, Emily shot back. Before Jason could respond, the waitress approached, setting down their drinks with a practiced indifference. Rough night, she asked, her voice monotone. You could say that, Jason muttered. The waitress gave a half smile, then walked away. As Emily scanned the journal, a word caught her eye. Vessel. The passage beside it was faded, but she could just make out the words. The vessel cannot be destroyed, only transferred. To sever the tether is to risk collapse. What does it mean by collapse? She murmured aloud. Jason leaned back, rolling his eyes. Who cares? It's all cryptic garbage. Sophie leaned forward, her curiosity overcoming her fear. What if it means the burden can't just stay with one person? What if it has to move? Emily frowned, considering the possibility. But how? And what happens if it doesn't? Jason's expression darkened. If it doesn't, maybe the whole place crumbles. Maybe it spills out into the real world. The idea sent a chill down Emily's spine. She glanced out the window, half expecting to see the hospital rising from the horizon, its shadow looming over them. Instead, her eyes caught something else, a faint figure standing across the street. It was too far to see clearly, but its silhouette was familiar. Her breath hitched. What? Jason asked, following her gaze. Emily didn't answer. She was already out of the booth, the journal clutched to her chest as she ran outside. The figure remained still, its outline flickering faintly like an image on an old TV. Ryan, Emily called, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but she felt its gaze on her. Then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed back the way they'd come, toward the hospital. Emily froze, her heart pounding. "No, you're free. You don't have to." The figure disappeared, dissolving into the shadows. Jason and Sophie rushed out after her, confusion etched on their faces. "What's going on?" Jason demanded. Emily turned to them, her expression grim. "It's not over. It's never over." In her mind, she could still hear the host's voice, low and mocking. "Beware its whispers." The car rolled to a stop in front of Emily's apartment building, the engine sputtering in the quiet. Jason killed the ignition, leaning back in his seat with a heavy sigh. "This is it," he muttered, staring straight ahead. Emily glanced at him. The lines on his face seemed deeper, as though the night had aged him. Sophie sat silently in the back seat, her arms wrapped around herself, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Are you going to be okay?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason snorted bitterly. "Sure. Why wouldn't I be? It's not like we just lost Ryan to something." He shook his head, his fingers gripping the wheel. "Let's just call it a night, or a nightmare." Emily didn't respond. She opened the door, stepping out into the cold air. The journal felt heavier in her hands, its leather cover cold to the touch. "Emily," Sophie called softly. "What are you going to do now?" Emily hesitated, her breath visible in the chill. "I'm going to figure this out," she said. "Ryan's sacrifice can't just end here. If this thing is still out there, someone has to stop it." Jason stepped out of the car, his tone sharp. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? You don't even know what we were dealing with." Emily met his gaze, her expression firm. "I'll figure it out." Jason sighed and looked away. "You're going to get yourself killed." "Maybe," Emily admitted. "But I can't just walk away." Sophie climbed out of the car, her movements sluggish. She hesitated for a moment, then hugged Emily tightly. "Be careful," she whispered. "I will," Emily promised, though she wasn't sure it was a promise she could keep. Jason got back into the car, slamming the door. "Good luck, Emily," he muttered before starting the engine. "You'll need it." Emily watched as the car pulled away, its taillights disappearing into the fog. For a moment, she stood alone on the sidewalk, the journal clutched tightly to her chest. Inside her apartment, the silence was deafening. Emily placed the journal on the table and sank into a chair, her body heavy with exhaustion. The events of the night played over and over in her mind. The hospital, the shadows, Ryan's sacrifice. She opened the journal, flipping to the last pages. The handwriting grew more erratic, the words scrawled with desperation. The host is a parasite, feeding on fear and despair. It cannot create, it can only twist and consume. The tether is its anchor, but it is not eternal. Beware its whispers, for they plant the seeds of its return. Emily frowned, running her fingers over the text. The words seemed to pulse beneath her touch, as though the journal itself was alive. Her phone buzzed, startling her. She grabbed it quickly, expecting a message from Sophie or Jason. Instead, the screen displayed an unknown number. "Did you think it was over?" Her stomach dropped. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners stretching unnaturally. Emily's breathing quickened as she looked around, her pulse pounding in her ears. The journal flipped open on its own, the pages fluttering until they landed on a single phrase written in bold, jagged letters. "Look behind you." Emily froze, her body paralyzed with fear. Slowly, she turned her head. The mirror above her mantel showed her reflection, but it wasn't her. The figure in the glass smiled, its lips curling unnaturally wide. Its eyes were black voids, swirling with pinpricks of light. "Hello, Emily," the reflection said in a voice that was both hers and not hers. The lights in the apartment flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Somewhere in the shadows, the host laughed.